Hello everybody, welcome back, or welcome if you're new. Today we'll be doing part 2 of this Time magazine. It's all about 1968, the year that shaped a generation. In the last video, we did the introduction, War and Revolution, and in today's video we'll be doing culture, and if it doesn't run too long we might also do race, but if I feel it's taking me too long we might just do culture. We'll see how I feel. But before we begin, I would just like to say, since my last video, I do have a few new subscribers. Thank you to everyone who has liked my videos, who has subscribed, who has commented. Just thank you so much for all of that. It means very much to me, and every time I get a new subscriber or a like or a comment, I'm running to my boyfriend and telling him all about it. So I'm very excited that you're here. So anyways, let's go ahead and jump right into today's video. Like I said, today we will begin with culture. Ain't got no class, ain't got no mother, ain't got no father, ain't got no culture. The generation that let down its hair in 1968 and sang those lyrics gave birth to forms that still shape popular music, literature, film, and television. Laugh-In begot Saturday Night Live. Julia paved the way for The Cosby Show. 2001: A Space Odyssey metamorphosed into Star Wars. Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix spawned heavy metal. Big Bird wanders down Sesame Street, still a hippie innocent, a naive, ever-hopeful thing with feathers. Hair Alone on Broadway and through its many tribes or traveling companies launched an army of performers who went on to mold the culture of the past 2 decades. Among them, the proto-punker Meatloaf, Donna Summer, the disco queen of the late 70s, and Diane Keaton, who nearly embodied the post-revolutionary woman, and Annie Hall. All ancestries link up in 1968. Swept away were the infallibility of the establishment, the virtues of sobriety and conformity, as well as Fred and Ginger, Lucy and Ricky, Mom and Apple Pie. The American empire was no longer propelled by an imperial visionaries, but rather by doubting, probing, experimenting, and persists. Assessing the message of The Graduate, film critic Stanley Kaufman wrote, "Life today in our world is not worth living unless one can prove it day by day by values that ring true day by day." The Graduate was the top-grossing film of 1968. In his novel Couples, John Updike was also tearing down facades, capturing the heavy breathing of the Protestant middle class and other suburban satyrs and nymphs. "Adultery lit her from within," he wrote of one character, "like the ashen mantle of a lamp, or as if an entire house of gauzy hangings and partitions were ignited but refused to be consumed, and rather billowed and glowed, its structure incandescent." Overwritten, perhaps, but in 1968, sex was a particularly American theme. As another Updike character said, "We're trying to break back down into hedonism. It's not easy." Amid the tearing down, freedom, love, and peace were set up as idols. The worshippers were themselves semi-divine, the new noble savages rhapsodized by The Who, the Stones, the denizens of Haight-Ashbury. As Steppenwolf sang in 1968, like a true-natured child, we were born to be wild. We have climbed so high, never one to die. But die they did, even the most brilliant among them. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, burnt out martyrs to the cause, done by drugs and alcohol. The nobility of their nihilism is, today, a nightmare. The dark side of the force set free in the 60s. The paeans to the generation's liberties echo dolorously, as love has truly become as strong as death. Sometimes, Eric Clapton said recently, you need to hear some harmonic softeners, some quiet to kind of quench the fire and calm yourself. But the fire cannot be fully extinguished. Though they abhor its destructiveness, those who lived through 1968 are still hooked on the energy, prisoners of their old freedoms. They may now feel safe, but they are sorry, for they were born to be wild. And down here at the bottom, it says, the Great White Way lets the sunshine in. Here, with its Aquarian revision of Washington crossing the Delaware, crossed over from off-Broadway, where it had its beginnings at Joseph Papp's Public Theater in the fall of 1967. Going for the stars while staying down to earth. Spacing out. In Stanley Kubrick's willfully enigmatic 160-minute long 2001 A Space Odyssey, audiences saw messages for 1968. When astronaut Keir Dullea is whisked toward the planet Jupiter in a whiz-bang psychedelic light show, many believe the director was paying homage to the drug culture. Anti-big business sentiments were aroused as Dullea maneuvered against Hall, the spaceship Discovery's nearly omniscient computer. Some pointed out that when Hall's initials are replaced by the letters that follow an immediate alphabetic sequence, IBM emerges. Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me, aren't you? So says Dustin Hoffman in the title role of The Graduate when he is subjected to the advances of Anne Bancroft, who plays the mother of the girl he loves. The Graduate won an Oscar for director Mike Nichols and established Hoffman as the first of a new breed of movie actors, charismatic without the good looks or machismo of old-time Hollywood stars. Some things funny, some things lewd. A new cast to old cliches. You're two wonderful people who happen to fall in love and happen to have a pigmentation problem, said Spencer Tracy to Sidney Poitier and Catherine Houghton. And guess who's coming to dinner? Appearing with Tracy in his last movie was his longtime friend, Katharine Hepburn, who would win an Academy Award for her role in this hackneyed attempt to deal with race and romance. Unmotherly instinct. In Roman Polanski's devilish vision of dark goings-on in enlightened Manhattan, someone says of Rosemary's Baby, he has his father's eyes. Knowing who the father is, Mia Farrow approaches her newborn's bassinet, well prepared. When she was bad. Trying to go 2 millenniums better than 2001, Roger Vadim cast his wife, Jane Fonda, as Barbarella, a 40th century adventuress who, among other things, rides on the back of a fallen angel and overpowers a deadly orgasmatron through sheer libido. Alright. Hello, gorgeous. For Funny Girl, Barbra Streisand would win an Oscar as Best Actress and prove there's nothing wrong with having the most famous nose since Jimmy Durante's. Explaining her appeal, Streisand is Fanny Brice, said in the movie, "I'm a bagel on a plate of onion rolls." If anybody knows what that means, please let me know, because I have no idea what that means. When they were fab, after months of meditating with the... I'm going to butcher this name, so excuse me. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the Beatles returned from India and dashed rumors of their impending breakup by releasing Hey Jude, the top-selling single of the year. A few months later came the White Album, with its plain cover and confusing mix of parody, Back in the USSR, whimsy, Rocky Raccoon, and sarcasm. Happiness is a warm gun. The Fab Four were back in business. What would you do if I sang out of tune? Buried alive in the blues. When I go on stage to sing, said Janis Joplin, it's like the rush people experience when they take heavy dope. I get stoned from happiness. I want to do it until it isn't there anymore. Booze and drugs laid waste to Joplin's health and etched heartbreak into her voice. Her album Cheap Thrills, with the group Big Brother and the Holding Company, quickly turned to gold in 1968. We've all come to look for America. Bridge over troubled water. While much of rock seemed rebellious and anarchic, the gentle, socially relevant songs of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel established a quiet center for the entire pop music genre. The inclusion of their songs Mrs. Robinson and Scarborough Fair and the movie The Graduate placed the film's soundtrack among the year's top 3 best-selling albums. The times they are a-changin'. 2 years after a serious motorcycle accident, Bob Dylan re-emerged in 1968 with John Wesley Harding. More commercial than his protest songs, the album and its title track did not seriously diminish Dylan's position as the poetic conscience of his generation. To them he would later sing, "May you grow up to be righteous, may you grow up to be true, may you stay forever young." Passionate poems of modern malaise. The year saw Joni Mitchell, previously a songwriter for Judy Collins and Tom Rush, coming out with an album of lyrical, personal musings, which she later described as "Sock It To Me Softly" music. Early in 1968, she had released her first single, "I Had a King," and looked back at her failed marriage. "I had a king dressed in drip dry and paisley. Lately he's taken to saying I'm crazy and blind." Love Against War and Private Grief. Popularizing protest. With her lustrous soprano, Joan Baez was instrumental in promoting the songs of such musicians as Bob Dylan and her brother-in-law, Richard Farina. In 1968, she released 2 albums, Baptism and Any Day Now, which made the hit charts. She also published her memoir, Daybreak, dedicating it with love, admiration, and gratefulness to the men who find themselves facing imprisonment for resisting the draft. Baez refused to pay taxes during the Vietnam War. To Live and Die in Crossfire Hurricanes. Heady hedonism, with Mick Jagger prancing like a satyr through their concerts. The Rolling Stones were bohemian, pre-epic, anti-heroic, and irresistibly subversive, said Jagger. That old idea of not letting white children listen to black music is true, because if you want white children to remain what they are, they mustn't. The Stones' 1968 hit, Jumpin' Jack Flash, was re-recorded by Aretha Aretha Franklin in 1986. Psychedelic miracle worker. Jimi Hendrix was to the electric guitar what Paganini was to the violin, and more. Left-handed, he played right-handed guitar upside down and behind his back. His virtuoso experiments with such electronic devices as the wah-wah pedal, fuzzbox, univibe, tape delay mechanisms, and sound distortion created the explosive extraterrestrial swirls of his music. He could make the Star-Spangled Banner sound like a B-52 bombing raid. Hendrix died in London in 1970 from the after effects of barbiturate intoxication. Burning Out. I Am a Guide to the Labyrinth, wrote Jim Morrison, lead singer of The Doors, in one of his poems. In 1968, the group released the ominous single, The Unknown Soldier. Morrison binged on alcohol and acid in the wake of their smash hit, Light My Fire. There should be a week of national hilarity, he said, a week of total freedom, but by 1971, at age 27, he was dead of a heart attack. Art for rock's sake. A drug teetotaler, Frank Zappa injected literary, classical, and jazz references into his witty 1968 solo album, Lumpy Gravy, including allusions to Igor Stravinsky and Edgar Varese. Backed by a 50-piece orchestra with 6 woodwind players and a 19-piece string section. Rock music, said Zappa, is healthy and valid artistically. It has all the answers to what your mother and father won't tell you. With the Mothers of Invention, Zappa also released a satire of 50s rock and roll, Cruising with Reuben and the Jets. The year before, the Mothers had parodied the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band with We're Only in It for the Money. Eric Clapton is God. So read Graffiti in London. Few rock musicians were as idolized as the Surrey-born electric guitarist. Of his style, he has said, the objective really is to make everyone feel like they've just been struck by a bolt of lightning. In 1968, Clapton and his group Cream released the best-selling 2-record live album, Wheels of Fire, only to break up at the end of the year after a tour of the U.S. and a final performance in London. In 1969, Clapton and Steve Winwood of Traffic formed the short-lived band Blind Faith. The Kids Are All Right. Infamous for stage acrobatics and for smashing his guitars at the end of performances, Pete Townshend of The Who would complete Tommy, the first rock opera, in 1969. In 1968, the group put out 2 albums, The Who Sell Out and Magic Bus, The Who on Tour. At one particularly raucous post-concert party during the group's first U.S. tour, a 5-tier birthday cake was catapulted into a crowd. Fire extinguishers peeled the paint off a row of parked cars. A piano was destroyed, and a Lincoln Continental rolled through a fence and into a motel swimming pool. Messenger of Love. Marvin Gaye was the sensual, enigmatic prince of Motown. In December 1968, he topped the charts with his classic solo, I Heard It Through the Grapevine. His duets with Tammy Terrell, Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, and You're All I Need to Get By are among the most sublime of pop confections. These Tears I Can't Hold Aside. Lady Soul. The booming, insistent song that explodes out of Aretha Franklin, said one black music entrepreneur, is not the moon in June, it's life. A year after her breakthrough single, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You, she released more hits, including Think. She would set a record by winning every Best Female Rhythm and Blues Performance Award at the Grammys from 1967 to 1974. Wow. Loneliness wouldn't leave him alone. Through his song Respect, though his song Respect was popularized by Aretha, Otis Redding found himself limited to the ghetto circuit. He died in a plane crash in 1967, shortly before his Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay became a crossover smash. Said a friend, Otis is responsible for the young white audience digging soul the way the black does. Sounds of San Francisco. Surrealistic bellows. When the truth is found to be lies, and all the joy within you dies, don't you want somebody to love? Though Grace Slick of the Jefferson Airplane could sometimes sing lyrics with a congealing sarcasm, the group trumpeted the ideology of love and drugs that poured out of Haight-Ashbury. By 1971, the group had fragmented and eventually evolved into the Jefferson Starship. Revolutionary Fun. Country Joe and the Fish had a 1968 hit, Fixin' to Die Rag, that invited listeners to be the first ones on your block to have your boy come home in a box. Said Country Joe McDonald, the most revolutionary thing you can do in this country is to really have fun. Playing on and on. In marathon concerts, the Grateful Dead knit song into song for hours of non-stop jamming, sometimes under the influence of LSD. One favorite endless number was Wilson Pickett and Steve Cropper's In the Midnight Hour. The group's die-hard fans, the Deadheads, have stuck with them through a breakup, a comeback, and numerous appearances well into the 1980s. Jerry Garcia back here. Many people now think that my grandpa and Jerry Garcia look very identical. Not so much back then, but now that they're both a little older. My dad used to call my grandpa Garcia because he looks a lot like Jerry Garcia. My grandpa is also a big Grateful Dead fan too. From beautiful downtown Burbank. Very interesting, but wild. After the series premiere on January 22nd, 1968, everyone was betting his sweet Pippi to get on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Even Billy Graham and Richard Nixon did guest spots. Maniacally placed, the show littered the television landscape with jokes good, bad, and terrible, ranging from absurd definitions, a myth is an effeminate moth, to political jabs. Spyro Agnew, your new name is ready. Among the faces in its jokes wall were Chelsea Brown, Artie Johnson, Joanne Worley, Judy Garn, and Ruth Buzzy. Said Dan Rowan, it is obvious that a show such as this cannot be done. I ran on NBC for 5 years. Say Goodnight, Dick. Eyeing the success of CBS's Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, NBC signed Dan Rowan and Dick Martin, a nightclub comedy team, to do a special. While not a rating success, the show was critically acclaimed, leading the network to book a 13-show series against the likes of Lucy and Gunsmoke. Within weeks, Laugh-In was the top program in the country. Go Go Club Glub. Caught being flipped with Judy Garn and Chelsea Brown, giggly Goldie Hawn would become one of the biggest stars to emerge from Laugh-In. She would win the 1969 Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role in Cactus Flower. Favorite guest star. born Herbert Khoury, the son of a Lebanese immigrant. Tiny Tim and his dear, sweet ukulele made several appearances on Laugh-In. With his unearthly falsetto, he made the old song Tiptoe Through the Tulips a novelty hit. He brushed 6 times a day, 3 times with toothpaste, 3 with papaya powder, to keep up his smile. Stepping into the family room. Autumn of the Patriarch. By the fall of 1968, Bonanza was into its 10th season, and Lorne Greene, as Ben Cartwright, was still serving up pithy lessons to sons Hoss, Dan Blocker, and little Joe, Michael Landon. Butler Knows Best. On NBC's Family Affair, Sebastian Cabot was the genial and philosophical Giles French, nanny to 3 orphaned but well-off kids, played by Anissa Jones, Joni Whittaker, and Kathy Carver. In Living Color, Julia was blasted for being sugary and preposterous, but its star, Diane Carroll, replied, "Somebody decided, let's have a black lady starring on TV in 1968. 1968, why did it take so long? Isn't that an outrage?" Aw Shucks. 4 seasons after being spun off from The Andy Griffith Show, Gomer Pyle, USMC, with Jim Nabors as a gangly and unhip Marine, became the second most popular television show of 1968. Dang Them Hillbillies. Critics hated the Beverly Hillbillies, but the show ran for 9 years with uniformly high ratings and engendered cornbone cousins like Green Acres and Petticoat Junction. In 1968, with 5 more years to run, Jed, Granny, and Ellie Mae Clampett were coasting along in 10th place in the Nielsen's. My mom is a big Beverly Hillbillies fan. My grandpa probably is too. A network eye on social and political dramas. As Uncle Walter goes. Returning from the Tet Offensive, anchorman Walter Cronkite reported that it was now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. His pessimistic assessment perhaps did more than anything else to turn American public opinion against the frustrating war. Galvanizing debate. On May 21st, 1968, CBS broadcast a documentary called Hunger in America to coincide with congressional hearings on the subject. "Hunger is easy to recognize when it looks like this," said narrator Charles Kuralt over a film of a malnourished child. "This baby is dying of starvation. He was an American. Now he is dead." Agriculture Secretary Orville Freeman denounced the program as biased, one-sided, dishonest. Tick, tick, tick. Harry Reasoner, Don Hewitt, and Mike Wallace confer on the set of 60 Minutes, a magazine-format news show that was launched in 1968. Though the program now seems permanently ensconced near the top of the Nielsen's, its early ratings were in the cellar. Wrote Time, the opening show amounted to a good cub reporter. Strife. Commercial graffiti. Peter Max liked to explain that his flair for otherworldly psychedelic patterns was instilled during his boyhood in Shanghai, where he watched Buddhist monks painting a pagoda. The enterprising artist pushed his decals and paintings through the tie-ups with some 50 companies, including General Electric, Sears, and J.P. Stevens. Disposable art for a consumer society. Pop realism. Unable to appear at campus lectures in the fall of 1967, Andy Warhol sent a look-alike to speak in his place. "He was better than I am," said Warhol, shown here with the French actress Martine Barrett. On June 3rd, 1968, the pop artist was shot in the chest with a .32 cal automatic at the factory in his New York studio. The assailant was Valerie Solanas, a Warhol acquaintance and rabid feminist who had founded SCUM, the Society for Cutting Up Men. Warhol was discharged from the hospital 2 months later. Graven image. The pop icon of the decade was Robert India's Love, released as a Christmas card by New York City's Museum of Modern Art in 1965. The design would later appear as a series of paintings, a massive steel sculpture, and more. Said Indiana, it's the century's most plagiarized work of art. Pop goes the written word. Peeking into an adulterous society. John Updike's Couples was a 1968 sensation. Knopf ordered a huge 70,000 copy first printing. Hollywood paid $500,000 for the movie rights. Only 3 weeks after publication, the novel was a bestseller. Fruits of Solitude. In 1968, when Gabriel Garcia Marquez's No. 1 Writes to the Colonel appeared in the U.S., the Colombian was already a year deep in acclaim for 100 Years of Solitude, published in English in 1970. Branching out. Not only was Norman Mailer writing and reporting Miami and the siege of Chicago, his book on the year's conventions, he was directing Maidstone, a film about a director who becomes a presidential candidate. Still Howling. Allen Ginsberg, shamanic poet of the Beat Generation, published Planet News and Airplane Dreams during the year. He was tear-gassed while chanting at a Yippie festival during the Chicago Democratic Convention. Crying Wolf. The most audacious of the new journalists, Tom Wolfe continued in 1968 to apply the techniques of creative writing to reportage. He published 2 volumes of his essays during this year, The Pump House Gang and The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, the latter a kind of non-fiction novel about Ken Kesey, the celebrated prankster, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now we're going to go ahead and start the section about race. Martin Luther King Jr.'s staff called the labor troubles in Memphis a distraction and advised against his going there. They argued that King had a mass of details to work out for the Poor People's Campaign, a nationwide series of marches and speeches that would end with a giant rally in Washington. But the civil rights leader insisted on marching in Memphis, where black sanitation workers employed by the city were demonstrating to form a union. These men, he said, were abused and overworked, yet unwilling to remain silent. Exactly the qualities he was looking for. Said King, "You're doing in Memphis what I hope to do in the Poor People's Campaign." A freak storm covered the city with 25 inches of snow that late March week, making conditions unfavorable for public protest. But it was the violence that would distress King more. Members of the Invaders, a local group of black militants, infiltrated his march with the garbage men. When windows were smashed, police moved in against orderly demonstrators and radicals alike. Despondent over the chaos and the rift in his once solid movement, King said, "Maybe the good people should just stand aside until the violence has run its course." But King began preparing for another demonstration. The week after the disastrous march, he delivered one of his most stirring speeches to supporters at Centenary Methodist Church. "I just want to do God's will," he declared, "and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Shortly after 6, the next evening, King was shot dead by an assassin. Despite pleas for calm from his widow, Coretta Scott King, blacks throughout urban America turned to violence. When white America killed Dr. King, she declared war, said radical Stokely Carmichael. The nation's cities, at least 125 and 28 states, caught fire. Washington, Chicago, Baltimore, and Kansas City were hardest hit. More than 65,000 federal troops were required to quell the disorders which raged for a week. At King's funeral in Atlanta, as truth was marching on, mourners played a tape of his last sermon. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry, that I did try in my life to clothe the naked, that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison, that I tried to love and serve humanity. On April 8th in Memphis, 42,000 people walked silently in the march Martin Luther King Jr. had planned. By the end of the month, Ralph Abernathy, his friend and successor, kicked off the Poor People's Campaign. In May, the campaign arrived in Washington. There, 2 months after King's death, a makeshift village arose. It was called Resurrection City, USA. The Children of Wrath. Fear and despair cloud the faces of 2 Chicago schoolboys during the black riots that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In Memphis, death on a motel balcony. Within the assassin's sights, from his suite at the Lorraine Motel, King heads for dinner with close aides Ralph Abernathy, Wright, and Jesse Jackson. That evening, James Earl Ray checked into a rooming house across the street. A small-time hood, Ray had broken out of the Missouri State Penitentiary a year before, purchased a hunting rifle in Birmingham, and spent the past few weeks stalking King in Memphis. "You better put your coat on, Doc," King's driver told him seconds before Ray opened fire. "It will be cold tonight." My God, it's all over. King falls, shot through the throat. Among his associates pointing in the direction of the assailant is Andrew Young, later mayor of Atlanta, who cries, oh my God, it's all over." Abernathy cradled the head of his friend, saying, "Martin, this is Ralph. Don't worry. It's going to be all right." But King could only quiver his lips. He could not speak. Ray escaped in a white Mustang and made his way to London. He was arrested 3 months later. Atlanta mourns. Drawn by a pair of Georgia mules and followed by 100,000 marchers in dignified silence, King's casket moves through the city of his birth to its final resting place in the Southview Cemetery. The body had been flown in from Memphis on a plane chartered by Robert Kennedy. On the marble tomb would be emblazoned the words of the old spiritual that he had made his own: "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." The sorrow and the fury. The stoic widow. Often at her husband's side in his marches, Coretta Scott King was with her children in Atlanta the day King was shot. Upon learning of his death, she told her daughter not to hate assassins. "Your daddy wouldn't want you to do that." In Memphis the day before the funeral, she pleaded for calm and sanity. How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society? How long will it take? Anger in the cities. Chicago firefighters battle infernos set by rioting mobs in the wake of King's death. 11 people, all of them black, were killed in the rampage, and 162 buildings were destroyed by flames. Mayor Richard Daley ordered police to kill arsonists and maim or cripple looters. Said Jesse Jackson, "The mayor may have a killing program for the dreamers, but he has no program that can kill the dreams." Toward an angry new consciousness. The power of paramilitarism. Founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the Black Panther Party espoused an ideology at once Marxist and Maoist, anarchic and hierarchical, paramilitaristic, and socially hip. With their leather jackets, berets, and dark glasses, the Panthers were a small but visible segment of the growing black consciousness movement. Said Panther leader Stokely Carmichael, "When you talk of black power, you talk of bringing the country to its knees, of building a movement that will smash everything Western civilization has created." Sleights of hand. From the accoutrements of African culture to the calls for political secession, the new militant consciousness stressed the separateness of blacks. In Vietnam, Black Marines developed a series of complex fraternal handshakes. Back in the States, variations on the greeting developed. Other symbols of radical pride: Yoruba-style turbans for women, the afro haircut, and the raised fist of black power. Ghetto Gothic. In Harlem, a mother and her children gather in their kitchen. Poverty, said one psychologist in 1968, destroys the young before they can live and the aged before they can die. The persistence of discrimination and neglect led a presidential commission in 1968 to call the U.S. a nation of two societies, one black, one white, separate but unequal. In 1968, more than 1 out of 3 blacks lived below the poverty level. Today, despite a growing black middle class, the proportion has barely improved. A monumental turnout for the poor. Resurrection City. In the shadow of the Washington Monument, 3,000 marchers raised a shanty town of plywood and canvas as the finale of the Poor People's Campaign. King had proposed the project in August 1967 to bring the plight of the poor to the doorstep of the federal government. In one of her many speeches during the months-long rally, Coretta King stressed her husband's nonviolent methods but added, "Starving a child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence." A blow for Martin. Ralph Abernathy, a leader of the campaign, hammers in the first nail of Resurrection City, King's unfinished project. Earlier, after leading a delegation through government offices, Abernathy said the leaders here for the first time heard the cries and groans of the poor people speaking in their own language, unpolished, and outpouring from the souls of poor people. It's not white power, it's not black power either. It's poor power, and we're going to use it. And that is where we will stop for today. We will pick up on politics here with Bobby Kennedy in part 3, and which will be the final part to this 1968 Time magazine. Thank you guys for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed part 2. Again, I just want to give a quick thank you to everyone who has subscribed, commented, liked my videos. It means the absolute world to me and makes me very excited to make these videos for you guys. I will see you guys in the next video, which again will be the finale, if you will, of this magazine. thank you guys for joining, and I will see you next time.